now.
Okay. All right, I'm going to get started. So today what we're going to talk about is really the roots of the obesity epidemic and how we sort of got here, because everybody knows that sort of obesity has not always been a problem. If you look back in the 50s and 60s, there's not a really big problem in obesity. But then you get to sort of the 80s and 90s, you have this huge rise in obesity, which sort of fuels all this metabolic disease, which is type 2 diabetes, the metabolic syndrome, which then fuels heart disease, stroke, and cancer, which then kills people. So really, if you want to look at our healthcare system right now, you really have to get to the roots of how we got here to this obesity crisis to see where we can change things. So if you look back at the history of obesity medicine, what you can see is that people didn't really ever talk about calories. The first diet book was actually written by William Banting in 1863. It was called Letter on Corpulence, and what his strategy was to avoid all basically carbohydrates. What happened was that he was sort of gaining some weight. He was about 60 years old. So then he tried all the usual sorts of stuff. He tried to eat less, and it didn't really work. So then he tried to increase exercise. He went rowing on the Thames a lot, and he got more fit, but he actually didn't lose any weight. So he went to his surgeon at the time, and he said, well, you should avoid bread, and you should avoid sugar and all those sorts of things. So he cut them all out, and he did very well. So he published it, and that's generally acknowledged as sort of the first diet book. So these low carbohydrate diets, everybody calls them the fad. They're like 150 years old, right? It's not exactly a fad. It's more of a tradition. Then you get to William Osler, who wrote a sort of seminal textbook called The Principles and Practice of Medicine in 1907. And he's often called the father of modern medicine. He was a Canadian. And when you look at what he thought about obesity, he wrote a monograph of obesity. And what he said was that fatty foods are actually crucial because they increase satiety and decrease fat accumulation. So there's none of this eat low-fat foods. He is saying eat more fatty foods, right? And so he actually designed diets that featured beef, veal, mutton, and eggs. So that's what he thought about it. So again, this is more than 100 years ago. The sort of standard of medicine for the treatment of obesity, which acknowledged is not a big problem at the time, is to eat sort of less carbohydrates and more sort of protein and fat. By the 1960s, it's fairly common knowledge. So if you go to books like Dr. Spock's Baby Care, which is a very widespread book, what you see is that they say that rich desserts, the amount of plain starchy foods such as cereals, breads, and potatoes taken, is what determines how much weight they gain or lose. So basically these sort of starchy foods, sugary foods, that's what causes obesity. That's what they said. And in the British Journal of Nutrition, 1963, every woman knows that carbohydrate is fattening. So it's not sort of this, niche sort of, it's a really weird low-carb thing. It's sort of common knowledge. Nobody really disputes that. Nutritionists think that, hey, it's mostly these starchy foods and sugary foods that are causing the obesity crisis. If you were to ask your grandmother or so on, she wouldn't talk about calories because, of course, they didn't really talk about calories back then. They would talk mostly about avoiding sweets and avoiding starchy foods. So where it all begins to change is this great epidemic of coronary disease. So what happened is that Americans in the 1950s and 60s started coming down with a lot of heart attacks. So there was this whole diet heart hypothesis, which said that eating too much fat causes heart disease. So the focus was not on obesity because obesity is not a problem, but the focus is on heart disease. And there's this whole hypothesis that if you eat fat, it clogs your arteries. So that this was developed in the 1950s and 1960s. And so prominent nutritionists like Gene Meyer said that carbohydrate-restricted diets, which were common then, were the equivalent of mass murder. So fattening carbohydrates suddenly became healthy whole grains. And if you look at it, you can see this epidemic of heart disease. So you see in the 1900s to the 1950s. So there's no genetic, it's not a genetic thing, right? Clearly something is happening here where U.S. deaths from heart disease really go up from about, say, 100 and less than 150 to like almost 400. So a huge epidemic in heart disease, and everybody's scratching their heads and saying, why are we getting so much heart disease in the 50s and 60s? President Eisenhower had a heart attack. It was a huge, huge problem. Well, if you look at cigarette consumption, of course, we know now, and we didn't back then, of course, the tobacco company said, no. Tobacco doesn't cause any kind of heart disease, doesn't cause any cancer, right? It's great. But you can see from the per capita cigarette consumption that it goes from virtually zero in 1900 to like a lot, right? So all the GIs go to World War II, they come back and they're all smoking. So if you look at the prevalence of smoking in the 50s and 60s, you know, it's somewhere around 40-50% of the population. Like everybody's smoking. You look at old pictures, people are smoking. You go to restaurants, there's the smoking sections, right? There's the little ashtrays and the little in the cars and the airplane seats. There's little ashtrays. So it's something that's very common. And this is where people were. So by the time you hit the 60s, you had the Surgeon General report, and then after that, it starts to dip. And you can see, of course, the very close correlation with that and heart disease. But in the 60s, nobody knew what was going on because tobacco, everybody knew, was good for you. So they said, oh my God, why are Americans having heart attacks? Must be the dietary fat, right? Because it can't be the cigarettes. And the guy who really pushed that was a guy named Ansel Keys, who is a very, very prominent nutritionist. So he developed the K rations, which were used in World War II. So he was really the top scientist of his day. And he did this 7-country study. And he said that, well, look, here's 7 countries. And if you compare the percentage of calories of fat and the heart disease deaths, you see a very close correlation. Therefore, it must be the fat, and more specifically, it was the saturated fat. So that was his hypothesis, and you see he's on the cover of Time magazine, so it really carries a lot of weight. But if you think about it, it doesn't make any sense at all. Because if you look at the actual consumption of saturated fat from 1900 to 1960, when heart disease deaths peaked, you can see that it's virtually unchanged. Right? So while cigarette smoking is going way up at the same time as heart disease, saturated fat is eating exactly the same. So it makes no sense at all to blame the dietary intake of saturated fat, which is exactly the same, as causing all the heart disease deaths.
The slide you had before where it said diet, saturated fat, diet, predicted, the second point there.
Yeah. Yeah, the question is about the 7-country study about the saturated fat. That 7-country study was a huge study. There's a whole ton of sort of secondary studies. It's one of these studies that has like 50 sub-studies, and that was one of them, the saturated fat. You can dig it back. It was published in the 1970s.
So it was directly related. They said about saturated fat.
Yeah. Directly related to heart disease, and that's where we got this whole thing about eating more unsaturated fats and eating less saturated fats, which we went for a long time. If you remember the old, I don't know if you were in medical school at the time, but there was the old AHA step 1, step 2 diets, if you remember, super low fat or super low fat for heart disease. And that's where we got to in 1977, where we got to this dietary goals for the United States. And specifically, they said decrease the fat consumption from about 40% to 30% and raise consumption of carbohydrates to about 55 to 60% of calories. So the problem with some of this data that came out was that the 7-country study was, one, epidemiological. So there's a lot of confounders. But the other thing is that he didn't actually look at every country that he had data on. He actually just took the 7 countries that best fit the line and sort of stuck them there. So if you look at all 22 countries that he had data on, it was a much less tight correlation. So he sort of cherry-picked the data to make his point look better, but he also ignored the sort of within-country comparison. That is, you can compare the dietary fat in the United States, forgetting all these other countries, and see if it has increased that that should have caused this increase. And of course, there was none of that. And so for the next sort of 30 years or so, we tried to pin heart disease on saturated fat or total fat. And virtually every single study that we did found no correlation. So 1963, you have a longitudinal study of coronary heart disease, no relationship of dietary fat to coronary artery disease. 1977, the same thing. 1978, same thing. In 1980, you had this 10,000 patient study followed over 6 years with no relationship of coronary artery disease and dietary fat. So it sort of went on and on. They kept trying to prove the point that eating fat clogs your arteries and causes heart attacks, but every single time they looked, they actually couldn't find it. What they found instead was something very surprising, which is that as you ate more fat, you actually had less disease. So, for example, in this study, they followed 8,000 men and looked at their dietary risk factors and risk of stroke. So if you look at that blue bar, that's the amount of dietary fat. They break them into quintiles. That is, Q5 is the people who eat the most fat, and Q1 is the people who eat the least fat. And their risk of stroke goes down substantially when they eat more fat. So it actually doesn't look like eating a lot of fat is risky. It's actually kind of protective. A 20-year follow-up of the Framingham data, so not some crappy little study, but a huge, well-followed study in 1997 showed the same thing. So again, breaking them into quintiles, they looked at who had the lowest intake of fat, and that's those people at the top who have the highest risk of stroke, and compared it to the people who had eating the most fat, which had the lowest risk of stroke. So fat was not risky at all, actually substantially protective. And this is 20-year prospective data, which is a hell of a lot better than what Ansel Keys did, which was a sort of one single cross-sectional study at the time. In Malmo, Sweden, they did another huge sort of study of almost 30,000 men and women. Again, breaking down into quartiles, Q4, which eats the most fat, seems to have about sort of 35% less risk of heart disease than the people who eat the most fat. So nothing much here to support this sort of dietary fat hypothesis. In fact, quite the opposite. It seems to point the wrong way. By 2009, you had a number of studies published. So this is published in the Archives of Internal Medicine that really looked at meta-analyses of all these studies we've done. So this is 2009. So this is like 30 plus years after we've been telling people to eat very low fat. And when you look at the sort of total fat, saturated fat, you see the risk hazard ratio. So it's 0.99 for total fat for either coronary outcomes or secondary outcomes. Really, at 1.0, you see that there's no correlation at all between eating more fat and higher risk or less fat and higher risk. There really is no correlation at all. And this is over, if you look at the number of patients, it's like 160,000 patients that we've studied. So we can't find really any evidence at all that eating more fat is dangerous. And the randomized control trials, there were just none that showed that it was risky, right? And we were telling people left and right with these step 1 diets, step 2 diets to eat less and less fat. This is all through the 80s and the 90s. And there was no evidence. So even though we pretend that we follow evidence-based medicine, we were going on no evidence and just telling people to eat low fat just because that was the way that's what we told everybody, right? So eat less fat. But there was no data. Actually, the data suggested the opposite. And in 1989, you started to see some changes. So this is the DART diet and reinfarction trial, which is a kind of classic trial, which was a randomized control trial that really wanted to prove the point that eating less fat would reduce heart disease. So it was a secondary prevention trial, and if you look at fat advice versus low fat advice, you see that there's no benefit to eating low fat diets. And then they had this huge randomized control trial called the Women's Health Initiative, which randomized almost 50,000 women to a low-fat diet. So you can see that the total energy, they reduced their intake by about 360 calories. They reduced their fat intake from about 40% to 30% and increased their carbohydrates from about 44 to 52%. So exactly what we told people to do, which is eat less fat, eat more carbohydrates. So this, then they looked at, hey, is there any benefits to heart disease? They increased their exercise by about 10%, so these are metabolic equivalents, and this was the result, published in 2006, 13 years ago. You see for MI, cardiac deaths, revascularization, or stroke, no difference. That is, eating less fat didn't make any difference whatsoever. But there was other data. So the Lyons Diet Heart study, of course, looked at this low-fat diet. And what they found in 1994 was that this sort of Mediterranean diet, which is a sort of vague term, did way better. Like there was a 75% risk reduction in people who are eating more of these fatty fish and olive oil and all these sorts of stuff compared to the sort of standard low-fat advice that we had given people. And other data, for example, for nuts. Nuts were very high in fat. They are very high in fat. And for years, we told people, don't eat nuts because they're super high in fat. Same with avocados. Don't eat avocados. They're super high in fat. And the Adventist Health study, for example, showed that if you eat a lot of nuts, it's actually substantially protective for heart disease. So that's when things started to change, and we started talking about healthy fats, right? Whereas before there was no healthy fats. In the 90s, all fats were bad. So we can take a look at the saturated fats. People said, okay, well, maybe the unsaturated fats are still bad for you, and the saturated fats that you see in like meat, for example, dairy, maybe those are still really, really bad for you. And these are the animal fats for the most part. So if you compare beef, for example, it's mostly saturated compared to cottonseed oil, which is mostly sort of omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. And butter is the same thing. So you can see, first of all, that all sort of natural sources of fat contain a mixture of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. So the sort of, if you look at the monounsaturated, which a lot of people think are quite beneficial, you can look at like butter, for example, or beef tallow. There's a lot of monounsaturated fat in there. There's a lot of saturated fat too, but there's a lot of monounsaturated. So it's not like pure saturated fat. And you can see that after the sort of 50s and 60s, butter consumption really dropped off a cliff because we told people that dietary fat, saturated fat's not that good for you. And we switched instead to vegetable oils, right? So this is where we told people you should stop eating butter and you should eat margarine instead. That's where it came from. And again, by the late 90s and 2000s, as we're trying to find the evidence to show that it's really harmful, the evidence actually shows the exact opposite. So this is the Health Professionals follow-up study, which was published in the BMJ. It's a huge sort of prospective study of health professionals. I think Harvard runs that. And again, they break it into quintiles. Q5 is the people who eat the most saturated fat, and they still have substantially less heart attacks than the people who eat the least. So Q1, Q2. So eating more fat doesn't really appear to be all that harmful. 2009, there's a big meta-analysis again, looking at all the studies that have been done over the last 30, 40 years at saturated fat specifically. And what they find at the bottom is that for heart disease, the top group is for heart disease, there's really no correlation between how much saturated fat you eat and heart disease. If you look at stroke, they're actually may be slightly protective. And newer epidemiologic studies, which are looking at sort of many countries instead of just 7 countries, find that if you take more saturated fat, you have less heart disease. So totally the opposite of what we had been taught and we had been teaching people for decades. This cohort of almost 60,000 Japanese men looked at saturated fat intake and mortality from cardiovascular disease. So again, quintile 5 is eating the most saturated fat, and they have substantially less heart disease than the others. Risk of diabetes shows the same thing. So the more fat you eat, the less diabetes that you get. Inflammation, because we know now it's not a matter of sort of clogging up the arteries, but it's actually an inflammatory disease. You can look at CRP or HOMA, which is a measure of insulin resistance. And again, quintile 5 is far less. So the people who eat the most saturated fat have less inflammation and less insulin resistance. And of course, we actually knew all this. We called it the French paradox. So from the 80s and 90s again, what we said was, saturated fat's really bad for you. And we know that the French eat lots of total fat. They're eating cream, they're eating butter, they're eating lots of animal fat, and yet they have half the heart disease that Americans did. And this for years was called the French paradox, but of course it was never a paradox. The fat just didn't have any correlation whatsoever to heart disease, despite what we had been told on no evidence. And of course, that's what set us off looking at, is it the wine? Is it this? Is it that? But really, the fat just wasn't part of the story. And that's why even in the mainstream news, like Time Magazine, you've gone from sort of don't ever eat saturated fat to the 2000s where it's like, you should eat butter. And this is a total change in the last sort of 40 years. We went from eating butter to not eating butter and back to eating butter. So if you look at margarine sales, for example, and butter went way down in the 50s and 60s. We all switched to margarine, and then margarine sort of sales are now plummeting, and giant companies like Unilever are trying desperately to get out of it, right? And as people ate more butter, there's always a few naysayers that said, people are going to get so much heart disease. And so this is data from Sweden. If you look at butter consumption on the right-hand side, that's that yellow bar. That's butter consumption. You can see around 2000, the Swedes start to eat a lot of butter. And if you look at their death from coronary cardiovascular disease, it just kind of continues the same downward trend. So there's no increase, right? A lot of the people were saying, well, they're going to get so much heart attacks. It just didn't happen. And it's already been like 15 years that they've all switched back to butter. And finally, in the Lancet, so there's this study called the PURE study, which Salim Yusuf, sort of this very, very prominent cardiologist from McMaster, spearheaded. So a massive epidemiological study, 18 countries, 135,000 people over 7 years. And so they're trying to sort of recreate this epidemiologic study to say, hey, if people are eating more fat or less fat or whatever, are they going to die more often or going to get more heart attacks? So if you look, starting from the left, that's the energy from total fat. So as you eat more and more fat, what you see with the total mortality on the top or major cardiovascular disease, it goes down as you eat more fat, right? And this is from like just 2 years ago, right? This is the most recent data we have. If you look at saturated fat, it's the same thing. As you eat more and more saturated fat, you're getting less and less heart disease risk. Yes, it sort of goes back up towards unity, but there's no correlation. Monounsaturated fats, again, as you eat more of that's monounsaturated fat, risk seems to go down. And again, with nuts and olive oil, that's where a lot of people are thinking these are pretty good sources of fat, but you got to realize butter and animal fats also have a significant proportion of monounsaturated fat. And what caused a lot of heart disease? Well, that's that last bar at the right, which was total carbohydrate, energy from carbohydrates as a percentage. So as you eat a higher and higher percentage of carbohydrate, your mortality just goes up and up, right? And this is exactly what we told people to do. We told people to eat more carbohydrate and less fat. But the epidemiologic evidence actually says that you should be doing the exact opposite of what we told people all those sort of the last 30 or 40 years. So this gets me to the story of vegetable oil, which is very, very interesting. And it sort of starts back in the 1900s, and everybody thinks that vegetable oil is really so good for you. But if you look at the origins of it, it actually came from garbage. So why did we eat vegetable oil? Well, cotton was the first one. So it was cultivated in the United States in the 1700s. And in the South, right, they had all those slaves which were picking cotton. So they had lots of cotton. But each 100 pounds of cotton also produced 162 pounds of totally useless cotton seeds. So you needed like 2% of the seeds to plant new cotton, but the rest was just garbage. So they had these huge heaps, tons and tons and tons of cotton seeds, which they would dump into the river. And of course, eventually somebody found them out, and then they sued the companies, and then they had to do something with it. So then they thought, okay, well, by the 1850s, the technology advanced to the point where they could actually use it for lighting oil, which was great. Until in Pennsylvania, they discovered oil. So they drill a hole in the ground, and all of a sudden, there's all this oil. So the market for cottonseed oil as a source of lighting, and remember, before that, they had whale oil, and that's really what saved the whales, was this discovery of oil. They were getting extinct because people were using this whale oil to light their lamps. So anyway, so now what we're going to do with these sort of heaping mounds of toxic waste, you had all this cottonseed that's just rotting away. So what are you going to do with it? Well, why don't we feed it to people? That was a good idea. So that's what Crisco was. So it's crystallized cottonseed oil. There's actually no evidence that giving cotton seeds to people is any good for you, because you don't eat your t-shirt, right? So why would you give this to people? There's no evidence. But hey, when you took cottonseed oil, it looks kind of like oil. So you could blend it into olive oil and you could feed it to people. Well, so that's what they did. And of course, Italy got really mad, and they actually banned all American olive oil because it was all adulterated with cottonseed oil. And the whole vegetable oil industry actually started because it was cheap, not because it was healthy, because your feedstock, of course, is garbage, so it's free. So what Crisco did, which was very innovative at the time, was they hydrogenated these oils. So you have this all vegetable shortening. Hydrogenation, partial hydrogenation, is of course trans fats, which of course had never been in the human diet. But here it was, Crisco looked like food, so let's sell it as food, right? That was the whole idea. But it came from garbage and it was cheap. That was the only reason we ever thought it was good. So that's how we got margarine, with all this partially hydrogenated soybean oil. Prior to that, it was cottonseed oil. And everybody thinks it's really, really pure and nice, right? But it's actually not. Because what you have to do to get vegetable oil is a whole lot of processing. So if you take olive oil, for example, you take olives, you squish it, and get the oil. That's extra virgin olive oil. If you take corn oil, corn is not oily, like in the least. So what you have to do is you actually have to take tons of corn, you press it, then you spray hexane on it, which is a petroleum derivative, like gasoline, so that you can actually drag all this oil out. Then you have to refine it, remove it, degum it, bleach it, and then it's like all natural, healthy vegetable oil. So it's highly, highly, highly processed. And our bodies, of course, are not used to sort of processing all this. So lately, of course, we've realized that, hey, all these omega-6s have thrown our omega-6 to omega-3 ratios totally out of whack, which is highly inflammatory, which is super bad for you. But, for a long time, we thought, hey, vegetable oil's nice and healthy. They look healthy. And of course, that's how we got into this whole trans fat mess, because we told people to stop eating butter and eat more margarine. But margarine was, of course, partially hydrogenated vegetable oils or trans fats. And then by 1997, you had studies from Framingham. This is 20-year follow-up data from Framingham, which showed that people who ate a lot of margarine were like dying a lot. And it's like, now, of course, it doesn't seem like a surprise because they're eating a ton of trans fats. But the data to suggest that vegetable oils were beneficial was actually highly suspect. So if you look at, this is from 2013 in the BMJ, if you look at people who were in this Sydney Diet Heart study, those who took a lot more of the polyunsaturated fatty acids, which is that intervention group, they actually had more cardiac deaths, not less. So switching to vegetable oils looked sort of harmful. The same thing with the this one, which France in 1989. He took a large study, he put them on the treatment diet, which was reduced saturated fats, switch them over to vegetable oils, no change in the CV event rate, but an increase in all-cause mortality. So in 1989, they had already were having evidence that eating a lot of these vegetable oils was actually very, very harmful. And a reanalysis by Ramsden in 2013 showed the same thing. If you actually look at all the polyunsaturated fatty acid studies and then break them down according to whether or not they contain omega-3s or omega-6s, because both are polyunsaturated, what you find in the top part there is that if you look at studies that primarily increase omega-6 fatty acids, so vegetable oils, you have an increased mortality. If you look at those that have both omega-3 and omega-6, then they're sort of protective. So overall, there's no benefit, there's no harm. But it actually depends which polyunsaturated you take. And that's why everybody's so sort of enthusiastic about omega-3s, as opposed to omega-6s. And the irony is that for 50 years, we told people to go from butter to these trans fat-filled margarines, right? Those big tubs of sort of margarine that my mother-in-law used to have tons of. And every 2% increase in trans fat calories actually doubles your cardiac risk. So this stuff is actually pretty toxic to you. So in 2013, the FDA removes trans fats from the generally recognized as safe, or the GRAS list. So these are foods that are generally recognized as safe. They took trans fats off of that. In other words, they acknowledged that trans fats were like literally poisonous. So for 40 years or so, we told people to switch from eating butter to eating poison. And an estimated 100,000 people every single year died because of that advice, which actually stemmed from no evidence at all. So that was the most ironic part. And of course, Canada has banned trans fats, Denmark has banned, everybody's banning trans fats for good reason, because we know that these highly processed artificial fats are very dangerous to you, and these natural fats that we had been eating for sort of the last 2,000 years, hey, they weren't actually that bad for us after all. But there was more unintended consequences of the whole thing, because if you look at the original food pyramid, when we switched to sort of low-fat diets, to, hey, eat more carbohydrates. This is the food pyramid that we taught everybody in the school and all that sort of stuff, right? So it's not like, hey, you should eat more beans sort of thing. If you look at this food pyramid, it's, hey, you should eat more bread and rice and couscous and potatoes, right? So they're sort of like processed refined carbohydrates, right? So bread is made from flour, which is not a whole product. It's not like like flour doesn't grow out of the ground. It's processed, right? You take the wheat, you strip out the fat, you strip out the protein, and then you grind it into a fine dust. So it's a highly processed thing, and we're telling people to eat lots more bread. And it got to the point in the sort of 80s and 90s when this whole fat phobia came on, that you'd have things like the American Heart Association diet here, an eating plan for healthy Americans, 1995. So it says to control the amount and kind of fat, saturated fatty acids, and dietary cholesterol you eat, choose snacks from other food groups such as low-fat cookies, low-fat crackers. Like, these are good for you. Like, that's what they're saying, right? Eat snacks like cookies, unsalted pretzels, hard candy, gumdrops, sugar. It's like sugar, right? Like, what are you telling people, right? 1995, it's like, hey, you should eat more sugar and less butter, right? It's like, oh, that's smart. So the question is, how did we do, right? So basically, Americans and Canadians did what they were told. So if you look at the average fat intake, it drops from about 45% of calories to 35% of calories. And they do the other stuff we tell them to as well, right? It's not like the public doesn't listen. So if you look at hypertension, people are getting screened, they're checking their cholesterols, they're not smoking. And along with that, we're following this sort of low-fat diet. We're eating margarine and thinking that we're healthy. If you look at food availability, people stop eating eggs, butter, and animal proteins, and they eat a lot more grains and sugars. So mostly refined grains, mostly sugars. And if you look at sugar consumption, it goes up, right? If you look at the dietary guidelines, that's where everybody says, oh, fat is bad for you, therefore you should eat low-fat candy. So therefore sugar, which they never said you should eat more sugar, but it does go up because that's what people got told. And people are eating more grains as well. So total grains, or whether you look at wheat, it sort of had been coming down slowly into the 70s. And after the 70s, people started to eating a lot more carbohydrates and so on. And that's where we started to see obesity really take off. So remember that the dietary guidelines were never targeted at obesity. They're targeted to this sort of heart disease message. But the whole thing got sort of mixed up in that because we said that dietary fat was so bad for you. It had to be not just bad for the heart, but it had to cause all kinds of obesity and other things too. But when we cut it back, that's when we sort of got this huge rise in the obesity epidemic. So the carbohydrates couldn't be bad in that they're fattening, but good because they're low in fat. So they had to be good for you. So now carbs don't make you fat, they make you thin. Right? That was the new messaging. Against what William Osler and all those people had said for the previous 100 years. Based on no evidence, we said, hey, carbs make you thin, fat causes heart disease, so it also must cause obesity. Again, based on no evidence whatsoever. So then they came up with this whole energy balance paradigm. So therefore they said, well, if fat is going to make you fat, how is it going to make you fat? Well, it's all about the calories, right? So fat is 9 grams per calorie, protein and carbohydrates is 4 grams per calorie, and that's where we got all sold on this sort of message that's all about calories in, calories out. And the problem with this sort of message is that it's actually not true because people think that calories in is all about what you eat. And calories out is all about exercise. And since you control both, therefore the solution is just to eat less and move more. But this sort of whole calories theory is not based on human physiology. Like, there is nothing in our bodies which detects the presence of calories, right? So if you eat cookies versus you eat salmon, the hormonal response is completely different. We've worked out physiologic pathways for like everything, right down to the genetic level. So here's lipogenesis, like the creation of fat, or lipolysis, the burning of fat, right? You see triglycerides, you see glycerol, you see fatty acids. Like, where are the calories, right? There's nothing in there about calories. Here's basic metabolism, right? Proteins. When you eat proteins, insulin goes up, peptide YY goes up. When you eat fats, cholecystokinin goes up. When you eat carbohydrates, insulin goes up. Where are the calories, right? What physiologic pathway responds to calories? Because we know that the minute you eat a food, so if you eat cookies versus you eat salmon, the hormonal response to that food is completely and utterly different. You eat cookies, insulin goes way up. You eat an avocado, it does not, right? There's nothing the same about that food. Our body responds to it completely differently, yet we're supposed to ignore all the physiology that we've learned of the past 100 years and pretend that it's all about calories because when you burn them, they actually give off the same heat, right? It doesn't make any sense. It's based on physics and not human physiology. Same thing, when insulin comes in, this is the pathway. Right? We know it stimulates PI3K, it stimulates MAPK, increases GLUT4, which is what does the glucose, but in the meantime, it stimulates cell growth and proliferation, which has implications, of course, for cancer. It stimulates PI3K, which has implications for cancer, P10, that kind of thing. But where are the calories, right? That insulin response is so important to what the body is supposed to do because that's the instructions. Our body runs on hormones, but there's nothing in there about calories. Therefore, 100 calories of cookies and 100 calories of avocado are going to have entirely different effects on human physiology. They're not just going to cause the same fattening effect. And of course, you can see it, you can measure it, right? Low carb foods versus regular carb foods, that's the insulin level. Insulin spikes way up when you eat lots of carbohydrates. That's just what happens. And we know, for example, that insulin, one of its effects is to block lipolysis, right? So when insulin goes up, you cannot break down fat. In other words, insulin blocks fat burning. But the technical term is it blocks lipolysis. Now, we've known that for 50 years. So if you eat a food that spikes insulin up, it's going to block fat burning. That's what it's going to do. Another thing insulin does, it promotes DNL, or de novo lipogenesis. That's the creation of new fat from carbohydrates in the liver. So when you eat a lot of bread, for example, insulin goes way up. Your liver takes that and starts making triglycerides. You might get fatty liver from that, for example. But we know that insulin promotes de novo lipogenesis, and we know that if you eat bread, insulin goes way up. When you eat avocados, it doesn't. So why do we think that the calories is what's important here? Because if you burn fat or if you don't burn fat, it depends on your insulin levels, not the calories, right? It's just a, mind-numbingly crazy idea to blame calories when it actually has no physiologic role whatsoever. And we know it doesn't have any physiologic role. Same thing for satiety. So more important than, what you actually decide to eat is hunger and satiety. So again, we know that something like the ghrelin is important, GLP-1, peptide YY, cholecystokinin, for example. So what stimulates those cholecystokinin, for example, goes to the brain and turns off our appetite. Peptide YY goes to the brain, turns off our appetite. Well, fat turns on cholecystokinin. Carbohydrates don't. Proteins turn up peptide YY and turn down your appetite. That's why you eat a steak and you get full. So you don't eat just because there's food in front of you, right? You have very, very detailed satiety mechanisms that stop you from eating too much. It's so important that there's like 6 or 7 of them, right? There's stretch receptors in the stomach. When you eat a lot of food, it stretches and it tells you to stop eating, for example. So these are very powerful satiety mechanisms. And you can prove it to yourself. You go to the Chinese buffet, you eat a lot of food, right? And you're so full, and then can you eat any more food just because it's in front of you? It's like, no. You're going to make yourself nauseated because of these satiety mechanisms. But they're completely different depending on what foods you eat. And that's why you can eat a Chinese buffet and then have a slice of like apple pie or something, some refined carbohydrate that doesn't stimulate any of your satiety mechanisms. You can still put it in, but you could not put in a piece of pork, for example, because you don't want that peptide YY or the cholecystokinin to go up anymore. So these are very powerful hormonal signals that we decide are irrelevant because it's all about calories. Well, that doesn't make any sense, and that's the problem. Look at GLP-1, for example. So we all know about the GLP-1 agonists. They sometimes cause a lot of weight loss because they stimulate satiety. And what happens? GLP-1, for example, goes up to the brain and increases neuroprotection, decreases appetite, goes to the heart and stomach, and so on. And we have drugs that will stimulate GLP-1. Well, if we know that nuts, eggs, and avocados are the foods that sort of stimulate a lot of GLP-1, why do you pretend that 100 calories of nuts is the same as 100 calories of white bread? It's like, it's not. The effect on the body is completely different. You have to talk the language that the body is talking, which is hormonal, not calories. And that was the big sort of mistake. We've sort of changed into this. It's all about the calories, all about the calories. And the reason it is so popular is because that way you could blame people for their obesity, right? Because then if it's all about the calories, then it's all about what you eat and how much you exercise, right? And therefore, obesity is no longer a medical condition. It's some kind of psychological character defect of low willpower. That is, the obesity epidemic in North America was really just a collective loss of willpower. That's really what it was, right? It's like, that's sort of ridiculous. It didn't have anything to do with dietary advice to eat less fat. It was just a loss of willpower. And the problem with that is that if this sort of caloric reduction is primary, so the advice that we've given for 50 years is eat less calories, right? If it worked, I'd be the first one to prescribe it. But if you look at any standard textbook, so here's Jocelyn's Diabetes, said the reduction of caloric intake is the cornerstone of any therapy for obesity. However, low-calorie diets, none of these approaches has any proven merit. That is, this is what we recommend, but we know it doesn't actually work. And same thing with Handbook Obesity, right? Dietary therapy and reduction of energy intake is the basis of successful weight reduction programs, but the results are actually known to be poor and not long-lasting. which of course begs the question, if you know it doesn't work, then why would you recommend it? Why would you teach medical students to recommend it? Why would you teach doctors and dietitians that, hey, we should be focusing on caloric reduction even though we know it doesn't work? Everybody knows it doesn't work. It's not just the doctors. Everybody knows it doesn't work. And again, where's the randomized control trials that reducing calories is going to lead to long-term weight loss? Like, we pretend we live in an era of evidence-based medicine, so show us the evidence after 50 years that reducing calories is going to lead to weight loss. Well, here's the Women's Health Initiative study, right? 360 calories per day. They expected women to lose about 30 pounds a year. After 9 years, they lost about a quarter of a pound, right? So they thought they'd lose 30 pounds a year, sort of like 200 plus pounds after 9 years. And they actually lost a quarter of a pound. So that's your randomized control trial evidence of the effectiveness. That's the randomized control trial evidence of the effectiveness of this caloric reduction as primary strategy, right? It doesn't work. And everybody knows it doesn't work, right? You can look at anything. You can look at the statistics. It's not my opinion, right? You can look at the statistics of the obesity epidemic. It doesn't work. If you focus on calories, then it doesn't do anything. And the problem with this sort of caloric reduction as primary strategy is that what you wind up doing is just blaming the victim, right? The person who takes the advice, which we know is ineffective, now suffers from the obesity, then you blame them for that obesity. You blame them because, hey, it means you don't have any willpower. Not that the advice is bad, right? Because we gave a certain advice and they took it and it didn't work. So there's only two possibilities. One is the advice is bad, or the advice is good and the person didn't follow it, right? So instead of saying that the advice that we gave to reduce calories, right, you could eat, cookies for dinner sort of advice. Instead of saying that that's bad advice, we said the advice is good, but people didn't follow it. And then we simply blame the victim. And it doesn't make any sense, because if you look at the obesity crisis, you can look 1985. This is the United States data. So blue is sort of less obesity, red is good, is more obesity. What you find is that from 1985 to 2014, the prevalence of obesity has just skyrocketed. You've gone from almost 10% being the very upper limit of normal for obesity in 1985 to sort of the minimum obesity in 2014 of about 20%, right? That's a huge increase. 70% of Americans are obese or overweight. And this is the thing. So imagine you have a schoolroom of 100 children and one child fails. And then you say, well, maybe that's the child's fault, right? They didn't study. But what if 70 kids fail out of 100? Would you say that's the child's fault, or would you say that's the teacher's fault, right? And obesity is the same. If all these Americans and Canadians are developing obesity, is the problem with each individual person has low willpower and is a glutton? Or is it the problem that the dietary advice that we gave is bad, right? Well, it's clearly that the advice is bad and we've done nothing to change it, right? We're still out there pounding the table on, eat less calories, eat less calories, eat less calories. Thankfully, this whole dietary fat thing is all swinging around. But the calories part is still going strong. We still want to blame the victim, blame these individuals for following the very, very bad advice. And this is sort of what happened with the NHANES data. You can see obesity just kind of going up and up and up. And this is the real problem, right? The calories in, calories out sort of theorem of what we are trying to do. This is what, if you look at the calories in, calories out, it is true. So that's thermodynamics. So it's always true. But what we think about calories in is it's really about what you eat. And what we think about calories out is that it's about how much exercise you do. And therefore, it's all under your conscious control, right? But it's actually not true. If you look at it more closely, what you realize is that what you eat actually depends primarily on hunger, right? If you're more hungry, you're going to eat more. If you don't activate satiety mechanisms, you're going to eat more, right? And that's under hormonal control. And if you look at the calories out, it's not simply exercise. It's about the basal metabolic rate. That's the amount of calories that you burn, generating body heat and making sure your liver is working and your heart is working and so on. And that's under hormonal control as well. And it's not stable. It can go up or down by 30%. So it's really under hormonal control, and therefore it's not a conscious decision. Like, you can decide what to eat, but you can't decide to be less hungry, right? And that's what's important in the long term. And that's why we blame people for their obesity, because we say it's your control, right? It's all this bro science. There's, no pain, no gain, and you got to work out and all this sort of stuff, right? Because they want to believe that it's all about the sort of conscious control of obesity, as opposed to the 60s where nobody's watching what they eat particularly, and there's no obesity. But the difference is that they're controlling the hormones so that they're not getting the hunger, right? They didn't go with the low-fat food, so they're activating their satiety mechanisms, that kind of thing. You can't decide to be less hungry, and same thing for calories out. If you have a basal metabolic rate that's higher, you're going to burn more calories, you're going to be less prone to obesity. That's just the way it is. And yes, you can decide to exercise more, but no, you cannot decide to have a higher metabolic rate. You can't decide to generate more body heat, right? That's not a decision you can make. And so therefore, obesity is really about fixing the hormones that are there rather than fixing the calories. But because we ignore this whole hormonal story of obesity and say it's all about the calories, that's where sort of we've left everybody behind, and that's where we tend to blame the victim. So this is sort of the roots of the obesity epidemic, sort of how we got there. So we started with the dietary guidelines: eat less fat, eat more bread. And we got more obesity, right? This was designed against heart disease, not obesity. But as people got more obese, then they said, well, fat also makes you fat. So eat less fat, eat more bread. And then, of course, there was more obesity after that. So then they said, well, it's actually calories that make you fat. Fat has a lot of calories. Eat less fat, eat more bread. And that's where we are today. And that's sort of how it all came around. And one of the things that we have to recognize in order to change it is that we have to recognize what obesity is caused by. We have to recognize the roots, but it's not something that's caused by genetics, because obviously in 30 years, the genetics have not changed. It's not something caused by a lack of willpower, and it's not something caused by a lack of exercise, because again, in the 50s and 60s, nobody's exercising. There's no gyms anywhere. Nobody's jogging, right? There's nothing. It's really a hormonal, not a caloric imbalance. And the sooner we can fix that, the sooner we can help people get to where they need to go. Thank you. All right. Okay. Thanks very much. Any questions before I go? All right. Thanks. We'll take back the